to welcome you to the upper room once again. Love being able to be a part of your lives. Thank you for being a part of our lives. And I want to start with a interesting story about an older lady who was caught shoplifting, of all things, in a grocery store. She was brought before the judge. Her husband stood beside her, and the judge asked, "Why did you shoplift, and what did you shoplift?" And she said, "I shoplifted a can of peaches." And he said, "Okay, and why did you do that?" And she said, "Well, I was hungry." And the judge thought, well, that's a legitimate reason, I guess. He says, "As I try to decide what your sentence will be, I need to know how many peaches were in that can." And she said, "There were 6 peaches in that can." He said, "Okay, that's perfect. I'm going to give you 1 day in jail for each of those peaches. So you will have 6 days in jail to think about whether shoplifting is the answer to being hungry." All right? And she said, "I accept that, and I'm sorry, Your Honor, I've done that." He said, "Is there anything else that anyone wants to say here about this case?" At that moment, her husband raised his hand and said, "Your Honor, I need to add that she also stole a can of peas." I love that story. It's not really a story about marriage. It could be a story about marriage. It's really a story about judges. How many judges? That poor lady. She's actually standing before 2 judges when she thought maybe it was just 1 judge. I have a feeling she had an inkling that she had a judge standing next to her as well. Question for you, how many judges do you have in your life? Does it feel like a lot? You may have never come before a judge in a black robe, but you probably feel like, I've had plenty, my fair share of judges in my life. Second question for you, not a discussion question, we'll have plenty of those coming. Second question for you, for how many people are you a judge? That's maybe even more difficult, isn't it? If you're to be honest, how many people in your life, or from even a distance, do you serve as judge and jury? Well, we're going to get into that because Jesus now gets into that. We're in this series in the Sermon on the Mount we've called The Lucky Ones. We are so lucky that God, through His Son, has opened up the secrets to life, especially the secrets to living life in His kingdom. And we just came out of a section where we spent 2 lessons. What Jesus was teaching in Matthew chapter 6 was about worry. And He was very blunt and said, do not do that for 2 reasons. Number 1, it could ruin your life physically, emotionally, but it'll also really distract and distort your spiritual life. It'll really cause a barrier between you and my Father, basically, is what Jesus is saying. And then we came to verse 33, if you remember, and we found out that the key to really replacing anxiousness and worry in our lives is to place all our confidence in Jesus and seek Him first, and He will take care of all the things in our lives that we are anxious about, we're concerned about. Okay, now we move on to chapter 7. We're going to go through the first 6 verses today. And again, as Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, He begins with a command, and the command is, do not judge. All right. If worry wasn't your gig, there's a chance judgment is your gig. I'll be honest with you, right up front, this one hits home for me. So let's get into it. So here we go, Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Do not judge others, and you will not be judged. Okay, there's some ramifications to the back end of that, but the easy one to start with is do not judge. You might remember that we've talked about the pillars of secular thought and philosophy and beliefs. There's basically 4 of them that Natasha Crane, in her book Faithfully Different, pointed out that we thought were really worth considering. First of all, feelings are the ultimate guide. Second of all, happiness is the ultimate goal. And it's the third one, that our secular society would love to delve into in this verse, and that is judgment is the ultimate sin. Then she ended with God is the ultimate guess. So is judgment the ultimate sin? Well, Jesus says, do not judge. Most likely, the issue comes down to how we define judge, doesn't it? That word judge in the original language, the Greek language, can be defined as analyze, discern, render a verdict, condemn, or treat overly harsh. Well, we're going to deal with the first descriptions here in a moment, but really the truth is Jesus, when he uses the word judge, is actually talking about rendering a verdict on somebody, condemning, or treating overly harshly. So first of all, what he does not mean by judge is discernment. We know he doesn't mean discernment, and I'll read to you from a little bit later in chapter 7 what he says about discernment, but there is a fine line between the two, discernment and judgment, and we need to make sure we know where we stand on that. Jeremy Goldberg once said, "Courage is knowing it might hurt and doing it anyway. Stupidity is the same." That's why life is so hard. Oh, and that's what we're talking about. There is such a fine line between discernment and judgment. Discussion question: how do you decipher between discernment, judgment, and I'll throw one more in, opinion? All right, have a great discussion. Now, in the society in which we live, opinion and judgment have really been mixed together, haven't they? You can just share an opinion and many people will say, well, you're so judgmental, is the word they used. And that's why this passage is really challenging. I might call something an opinion that you might call judgment, and vice versa. And so we've got to really clarify between the two before we move on with this passage. So we go a little bit later in Matthew 7, just a few verses, and we'll get to this in detail, but I want to read it to you so you know that Jesus understands that it presents a bit of a dilemma for us. We go to Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, okay? So 15 verses down in your Bible, and he says, "Beware of false prophets who come disguised as harmless sheep, but are really vicious wolves. You can identify them by their fruit, that is, by the way they act. Can you pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? A good tree produces good fruit, and a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. So every tree that does not produce good fruit is chopped down and thrown into the fire. Yes, just as you can identify a tree by its fruit, so you can identify people by their actions." Does that sound judgmental to you? In the culture in which we live, that would certainly be a statement of judgment. But Jesus there is talking about discernment, and we'll go much deeper into that. 1 John 4:1 kind of backs that up. John writes, "Dear friends, do not believe everyone who claims to speak by the Spirit. You must test them to see if the Spirit they have comes from God. For there are many false prophets in the world." Notice what he says. You must test them. There is a difference between testing the spirits and judging people. So according to Jesus, judgment is a sin. Do not do that. Discernment, however, is essential. It is discernment that will help you decide to whom you would marry, or for whom you might vote, or with whom you might go into business. Discernment is essential. They are very different, as we'll get into in a few weeks. But for now, let's talk about judgment in the terms that Jesus uses, in the context in which Jesus is teaching it. In essence, judgment is simply this: an attitude of superiority. That's what it is. It's an attitude. It's not even, well, you said this and you said that. It's more of the way we think about life and about ourselves and others. So the question becomes, do you feel superior in any of the following ways? I want you to think about it deeply. Do you feel superior morally, spiritually, visibly, like your appearance? Do you feel superior educationally or relationally, intellectually or financially? I bet you can think of people in your life with whom you are very sure they feel superior to you in one or many of those ways. We're not talking about them, though. We're talking about you. And we're talking about me. Do we feel superior in any of those ways? As followers of Christ, we work hard to live in accordance with His will. And so the result of that is morally, our lives should be lived with excellence, which is great. The problem becomes when we become like the Pharisees, who think that their entire identity is about their moral excellence and how much more moral they are than all those around them. They also felt superior in their education, their intellect, financially. They're very wealthy men, and the list goes on and on and on. By the amount of time most of us spend in front of the mirror, you might think that we are sure that we must at least measure up in appearance, if not feel superior to those around us. When we walk into a room, what do you look around to see? Most people look around to see, how do I fit in here? That's important. Am I overdressed? Am I underdressed? Why is that? Because in this culture, there is a pecking order about superiority, and it has often to do with finances and appearance and status. And yet Jesus is addressing that very issue. Our perspective, and is it possible that there is an air of superiority that we live with that we may not even realize? Let's look at verse 2 now in Matthew 7. For you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. That is huge, because if I'm using a standard by which I judge others, I probably do not realize that that very standard could be used against me as well. There's an old man that came to live with his son and his daughter-in-law and his grandson, a 4-year-old grandson, and he was later in life. Later in life in terms of the simple things being difficult, like eating and walking and sometimes even talking. But they brought him into their home. But it wasn't long before the husband and the wife, the son and the daughter-in-law, became a little irritated with the messes that his father was making, especially at the dinner table. He struggled to get spoonfuls of soup or whatever it was to his mouth and would spill on the table, and sometimes things would be dropped under the table, and he was constantly making a mess, and they just got fed up with it, quite honestly. And they talked to him about it, and he kind of with his slurred speech said, well, I'm trying, I don't mean to do that, I'm sorry. But lo and behold, after each meal, there was a mess to clean up where the man's father had sat. And so there came a time when they talked and they were just exasperated with it to the point where they said, we need to do something so that this is not so difficult for us to clean up. So they placed his father, the elderly man, over in the corner with a card table to eat off of, and they placed beneath him a plastic sheet that would catch everything that he dropped, so they could just pull it outside and wash it off, I guess. And they gave him a wooden bowl because he had dropped a couple other plates and bowls and broken them. And so he sat over in the corner, and they went on with their lives, and it was easier. And the little grandson, the 4-year-old, would glance over at Grandpa once in a while and just kind of nod his head. And the Grandpa was very embarrassed by the state of his inability to do life with them in a normal way. And then one day, after some time had passed, the father saw his son over in the corner playing with scraps of wood. And it looked like he was trying to build something, and he thought, well, that's cute. And he said, son, what are you building here? And the little boy looked up at him with his big blue eyes and said, well, Pop, I'm just building the little wooden bowls for you and Mom to eat out of when you get older. Do you think that the older man was invited back to the table? The standard that we use for others is oftentimes not the standard we want applied to us, is it? So I have a question for you. Is judgment the same as having a very confident opinion about something you believe to be true? The answer is not necessarily. For example, the writers of the New Testament, the apostles, the early disciples, were all very confident that Jesus was who he claimed to be, the Son of God, the Lord of Lords. That confidence in what they believed did not mean they were judgmental to other people. Again, you and I live in a culture that says if you are confident that you are right about something, you are obviously judgmental to those of us who don't agree with you. And that is not the case, because we have every reason to be confident, especially in who Jesus is and who God is and what he asks us to do in our lives. So just that confidence level does not mean you're judgmental, as many people would assume. Again, being judgmental is about an attitude of superiority. So how is it that we slip into this kind of perspective? Well, there's some things we need to keep in mind. Number one, we never know all the facts in a situation, do we? Number two, we are unable to read another's motives. Do you really know the motives of everybody with whom you interact? Number three, we are prejudiced people, never completely objective. I'm not talking about necessarily ethnicity or income, but I think that we are a prejudiced people and we don't even realize it. And number four, we put ourselves in a position we are unable to fulfill, namely playing God. Are you aware that sometimes you play God? There's a really interesting story, I believe it to be a true story, about a young man who was an attorney in a law firm in Texas. And the law firm had this tradition, the man who owned it anyway, the head attorney, had this tradition around Thanksgiving. We're close to Thanksgiving time, so this story really works for us. And so what this man would do is he would buy huge turkeys and put them in the spot on the table in front of the seat in which each attorney, when they were all meeting together, would sit. And the tradition went like this, that before each attorney could take hold of that turkey, he had to spend time, or she had to spend time, being thankful for what they had, and especially thankful for the job they had at that law firm. And then they had to be thankful for the turkey, of course. And so that's the way this tradition went. This young attorney was single. He did not have a family, and so this always put him in a little bit of a predicament, because he couldn't use a turkey that large, but he took it anyway and accepted it and would take it home. On one Thanksgiving, his fellow attorneys thought they'd play a joke on him, since they knew that he probably didn't take that and eat it by himself, and so they made a paper mache turkey, and they filled it with lead weights, and they made it to look just like all the other turkeys. And so when this young attorney thanked everybody for everything and took his turkey and got on the bus to go home, he sat there and thought, what will I do with this turkey? It was at that time a man got on the bus and sat down next to him, and they began to have a conversation. And he came to find out that this man has been down on his luck. And he had a young family, and he simply could not find a job. In fact, he'd been interviewing for jobs all day, but had had no luck whatsoever. It is then that the young attorney thought, oh, this is perfect. I can give him my turkey, and he'll be blessed by it. I mean, it'll be perfect for he and his family. But then he had another thought. He thought, well, this is a proud man. He's trying to find work. He's not like a bum on the street that doesn't want work. So he will take it as a slap in the face if I just hand him a turkey. I should have him pay me something for it, and that'll make him feel better as a man. And so he offered the turkey to the man and said, I'll sell you this turkey. And the man said, really? He said, in all my busyness of trying to find a job, I have not even gone out and gotten a turkey. He said, yeah. He said, I'll sell it to you. He says, for how much? He says, well, what do you have? And he looked in his wallet and dug out some change out of his pocket, and he had like $2.30 some. He says, this is all I have. And he says, good enough. For $2.35, whatever it was, he says, you can have this turkey. And so he gives him the turkey, and he feels great about himself. Well, that was on like Wednesday, and the following Monday, when they all met together in the law firm, his buddies were so excited to see what had happened when he cut into that paper mache turkey. And it was then that he told them the story, and he had no idea. Discussion question for you. What do you think that man who had paid a little over $2 for a turkey thought of the man who sold it to him on that bus the night before Thanksgiving? And what would you be thinking about that man had he sold you that fake turkey? So the point being, we should never judge someone by appearance or think that we know their motives, correct? Someone may have the best motives, but if we assign them impure motives, we are well on our road to being a judgmental person, as Jesus warned us against. Now, we talked about in that last lesson about worry and anxiety, how confidence in God can really unplug the worry in our lives. And confidence in God is going to be necessary if we're going to overcome this challenge as well. In his great book, The Divine Conspiracy, Dallas Willard says this: "Our confidence in God is the only thing that makes it possible to treat others as they should be treated. When we enter the life of friendship with Jesus, who is now at work in our universe, we stand in a new reality where condemnation is simply irrelevant." Think about that last line again. We now live, if you're a friend of Jesus, if you have confidence in Jesus, you're now living in a place, in a moment where condemnation of other people is absolutely irrelevant. It has nothing to do with your journey with Jesus. This is probably what Paul had in mind when he wrote in Romans 8:1, "Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." If we are not condemned, how is it that we so easily put ourselves in a place of condemning other people for not measuring up when we know we don't measure up? So again, back to our premise that judgmentalism, or being a judge of others, is an attitude of superiority. And this is a familiar parable Jesus tells, but it's all about this. Luke chapter 18, verse 9. "To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else." Okay, so Jesus is talking about, in the Sermon on the Mount, these very people. I believe they were the Pharisees, these men. Jesus told this parable. So he tells them a story. He tells those who would feel superior to others, look down on others. He tells them this story. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. We've said this before, the good guy, as far as they're concerned, the guy in the white hat is the Pharisees, the guy in the black hat is the tax collector, he's the sinner. So they go up to the temple. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get." Wow, he's super spiritual, isn't he? Have you ever been thankful to God that you are not like other people? Jesus goes on. "But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his chest and said, 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.'" And now here comes the punchline to Jesus' story. "I tell you that this man, the sinner, the tax collector, rather than the other, went home justified before God." He was right with God. "For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." For all those who look down on others, for all those who have an attitude of superiority, Jesus says, you are not right with God. How blunt is that? If I have any attitude of superiority in any way, in any area of my life, in regard to how I measure up to other people, how they measure up to me, Jesus says, you are not right with God. You are not in alignment with God and His will. What a powerful story. Next discussion question. Why do you think Jesus was accused of hanging out with riffraff? And he was. Accurately, he hung out with the riffraff. Why do you think they accused him of that? So the pious around Jesus were confident that they were so superior to the pagans, and so they made their life about that. And that caused them to doubt that Jesus could possibly be the Son of God, because certainly the Son of God would know that the people around him were pagans and were unworthy of any attention that they might give them. And that's why Jesus was accused. If you were the Son of God, you would know that these people are undeserving and that the rest of us are so superior. And the fact that you don't feel superior to them, that you would actually share meals with them and laugh with them, That's why they hated what Jesus did, because they hated the fact that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. The Son of God would never do this. So are there any other passages that back up what Jesus says? Not as though we need other passages to back him up. His word is absolute truth. So of course there's other New Testament passages that support what Jesus has said. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 14 verse 10. You then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Why do you treat them with contempt? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. It is written, as surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me and every tongue will acknowledge God. He's quoting from Isaiah 49 and 45 there. So then, each of us will give an account of ourselves to God. That is a truth. You will give an account for your life, not my life. I'll give an account for my life, not your life. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. We will stop it now. We will stop deciding the fate of other people. In other words, contempt and condemnation are not a part of our life anymore if you've signed on to follow Jesus. Take you to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. Paul writes again, my conscience is clear, but that doesn't prove I'm right. It is the Lord himself who will examine me and decide. So don't make judgments about anyone ahead of time before the Lord returns. Don't decide the fate of anybody until Jesus comes back, because that's his job. For he will bring our darkest secrets to light and will reveal our private motives. Just yesterday, Christy and I were talking about a man, I don't know how we remembered this guy, but several years ago, who left the church we were at. It wasn't that we were sinning in the way we were doing things. He just had contempt for it. And of course, later on, we found out that there were a lot of skeletons in his closet. And that's kind of how we all operate, isn't it? I don't want people to notice the secrets I keep in the dark places, so I keep the attention on others that we can put in their place. So that's the command of Jesus. It's simple. Do not judge one another. And then he gives reasons why. And now we come to what I want to call the comic confrontation. And many of you think, how can you be talking about Jesus and talk about comedy? We know that Jesus used many figures of speech when he taught. It's one of the many things that made him a brilliant teacher. And hyperbole is one of those figures of speech that he would use. And what he says now is pure comedy. It's to make people smile and to make some people mad. Which is good comedy, actually. So here we go in chapter 7, verse 3. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, hey, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye, when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite! First, get rid of the log in your own eye. Then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. First of all, notice that he says it's not wrong to notice a speck in your friend's eye. You know, in fact, the word speck is actually more like a little twig sticking out. That's a problem. It's not wrong to see something that probably needs some correction. But Jesus' point is you're in no place to be taking even a little stick out of a friend's eye if you've got a huge log in your own, which brings us to our location today. We're just a few miles from our house at Frontier Homes, Log Homes. And this is owned and run by our friends Dave and Terry Kemp, and they are so generous to let us spend a chilly morning over at their place. As you can see, this is where they build and assemble log homes. And so from time to time you may hear a chainsaw going, but for the most part we have some real freedom here this morning. But the point is this: Jesus uses an analogy that is unmistakable. As this guy over here uses his chainsaw, there are little tiny things that fall off to the ground, right? And if you get that in your eye, it's a problem. It really is a problem. But it's not near the problem as it would be if I had one of these logs protruding from my eye. In fact, if I had one of these logs protruding from my eye, you would say, I have the problem. And that's Jesus' very humorous point. And he drives it home, and then you might notice he says, you hypocrites. It's funny, everybody's kind of laughing in the audience, probably not the Pharisees, but then I guarantee you he looks right at the Pharisees and says, you hypocrites, you fakes. You are trying to expose other people for all their problems when in fact you have the greatest problem of all. Sadly, this is such a common occurrence in our lives that we don't even realize it. I was thinking about this week, and I remember vividly several years ago, and we had more kids at home than we do now, and I remember just kind of ranting and raving. Sometimes it was vocally, audibly, sometimes, probably most of the time, it was just in my twisted mind, but ranting and raving about how the people in my family can't turn off a light, can't turn off a fan, can't turn off a TV, wasting electricity, costing us millions of dollars. And I just remember thinking on and on, what in the world is going on here? And then I went back into my office. It must have been this time of the year, my office downstairs, and I had left my heater on for several hours. Not only had I wasted a lot of money, but I actually had done something much more dangerous than anybody in my family had ever done. But that happens all the time to us if we're honest, doesn't it? We are log-eye people. That's who we are. And in fact, what we are is we are oblivious. We are absolutely oblivious, and I think that's what Jesus is saying. I believe that's what he's saying to these holier-than-thou, high and mighty, spiritual, religious people. He's saying, you know how oblivious you are to your real problems? And that's us. Raise your hand if you're oblivious. I think of oblivious as being clueless. Here's the actual definition of oblivious. Not aware of, not concerned about what is happening around one. So let me read the synonyms of oblivious. Here they are. Unaware of, unconscious of, heedless, unmindful of, insensible of or to, unheeding of, ignorant of, incognizant of, blind to, deaf to, unsuspecting of, unobservant of, insensitive to, unconcerned with, impervious to, unaffected by, indifferent to. That's a list of my life. Raise your hand if you are ever oblivious. I see those hands, but some of you are not raising your hand, and you really ought to participate. We are an oblivious people, and that's what Jesus is saying about these religious leaders. You all are oblivious. You're clueless. You're not paying attention to what is really the truth about life and your life. And worse maybe than even being someone who doesn't pay attention, we are blind. We are deaf, and that's what he's saying to the religious leaders. You are blind and deaf. You do not see reality. I want to take you back to King David, and you know that David was called a man after God's own heart. And so he was one who followed God passionately, and yet you know the great sin of his life. I mean, can you imagine? Everybody in the world, 3,000 years later, knows the great sin of David's life. Can you imagine if your sins are still talked about in 3,000 years? He committed adultery and he committed murder. Here's what's even worse. I mean, that's bad enough. What's even worse is he was clueless. He was oblivious. I take you to read about it from 2 Samuel 12, verse 1. The Lord sent Nathan, the prophet, to David. When he came to him, he said, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and another poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children." So this is not just, potential food. This is one of their best friends in their family. Many of you have pets like that. Okay, it shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. I think Nathan's going a little over the top, but he's making a point. Verse 4, "Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him." Okay, that's the story. You got it? That's the story David hears. And David, was a shepherd before he was a king, so this stuff matters to him. In verse 5, David burns with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die." Now think about what he did. He just took another guy's ewe lamb, took another guy's pet. He should die for that, David says. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Logai, Logai. Nathan now says in verse 7, you are the man. You are the man. You're the one that's guilty of that. You are clueless. You're oblivious, David. That is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, Nathan says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. You have a log eye coming out of your face, David. And David realizes that. Then he pens Psalm 51. I need forgiveness. I need a new heart. But the point is this. How can a man who has been following God with his entire heart be so oblivious to the log protruding from his own eye? If it can happen to David, it can happen to you. It can happen to me. Whenever we see others as expendable, we then are people who sit in judgment and who carry attitudes of superiority. That's what David was doing. That's what we do all the time. Jesus wraps all this in comedy, but there is something explosive inside this package, isn't there? We can laugh at his metaphor. We can laugh at his hyperbole. And this is the perfect place for us to be reminded of it. But inside is a little bomb that's about to explode all over those who stand in judgment of other people. And now he concludes in a really interesting way in verse 6. And this verse is what most people think is a standalone verse. It has nothing to do with anything around it, you know. But it actually is very connected to what we just read. Verse 6 reads this way. Don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. They will trample the pearls, then turn and attack you. Remember, in that society, in that culture, pigs, we see them as cute and tasting good. That was the worst animal. That was the most unclean animal they couldn't even touch. And so he's calling somebody a pig. The Pharisees are sure that he's calling the pagans pigs. But is he calling the pagans pigs? Is he saying, you know what, you don't even need to share this stuff with the pagans? Last discussion question. It's not really a question. It's more of an assignment. Work together and try to come up with all the times Jesus had negative things to say about the pagans that ran the culture in which he lived. Yeah, I'd love to see how you did on that. Remember all the times he condemned Caesar and had just gnarly things to say about Caesar? I don't either. I mean, Caesar was wicked. The Roman government was wicked. You think our government is wicked? That government was incredibly wicked. And what did Jesus say about them? He only spoke, to my knowledge, about them one time, about Caesar one time. And that was when asked about what to do with this coin that is being required by the government. And what does he say? Give it to him. Give it to him. Nothing negative to say. They made it. It belongs to them. Give it back to them. I'll take care of you. That's what he said. That, to me, is, as far as I know, all the negative things that Jesus said about the pagan government under which he and all his friends and family lived. That is it. When he talks about the pigs, I don't think he's talking about the pagans, right? Otherwise, he was having parties with pigs. You know who he's talking about, right? We have two choices. Was he talking about the pagans or the pious? I think you know who he was talking about. I honestly don't think Jesus had a problem with the pagans. Why else would he say, I have come for the sick? He saw them as they're people who have the illness of sin that needs to be cured, and I'm here for them. And he told the pious, not here for you. So we know now, in the context, of what Jesus says. Don't give the valuable things to the pious. They will trample it underfoot. This teaching I'm giving you, you're so lucky to have from the Sermon on the Mount. It's not for the pious. They'll just mash it into the ground like so many pigs do, totally unappreciating what I'm giving you. Instead, this teaching is for the everyday person, for you and your friend and your brother. So next week is an election in our country. How are we doing in America? Do we need other people to be running our country? I think I know what most of you think. I know what I think, you know. But the point is this. We tend to look at our country. I'll speak for myself. I look at our country and our culture, and I know who the problem is. And I know what needs to change. And I very easily stand or sit in the seat of judgment on many people I have never even met. I want to take you back to a guy by the name of Henry Blackaby, who wrote an excellent study years ago called Experiencing God. If you never went through that, I really encourage you to do that. All right, so he's a great writer, he's a great teacher, and he was thinking about the problems in America. All right, and actually somebody asked him years ago about the problems in America and the future for America. And I don't know about you, but I sit in a seat where I go, America's in trouble. We're hosed, okay? Here's what Henry Blackaby said. The problem with America is not the unbelieving world, the pagans. The problem with America is the people of God. Our gospel is canceled by the way we live. I'm never surprised at what the world does. The problem is with the light all through the Bible. The judgment came on a nation when God's people would not return to him. Don't fuss at the world, Blackaby says. It's acting just like its nature. God's attention is focused on his own people. The future of America rests in our hands. Wow. I would much rather find all the problems there are with those people out there. But I've said this to you before. In reality, Blackaby's right. If we had actually lived like we were followers of Jesus for the last 50 years, the church, this would be a different culture. Be a totally different culture. The problem is with us. We are Lagai people. That's what we are. And yet we're oblivious to it. And we so much more enjoy pointing the finger at everybody else. The pagans do what the pagans do. They always have, they always will. They did in Jesus' time. He didn't make a fuss over it. He was concerned about those who claimed to know God, wasn't he? And so our tendency is to place blame on the pagans when in fact it is the pious. It is those of us who claim to know God. I came across this little excerpt. You may have heard it before. I don't even know where I found it. I want to read it to you because I think it's significant in the times in which we live. Jesus didn't eat with sinners and tax collectors because he wanted to appear inclusive, tolerant, and accepting. He ate with them to call them to a changed and fruitful life, to die to self and live for him. His call is for life transformation, not affirmation of identity. Okay, so here's the balance. The balance is for those of us who are joining in with the pagans and saying, oh, Jesus was okay with any kind of a life. That's not true. He did spend his time with those who needed him, and he did love them, but the goal was to love them into the kingdom, not for the kingdom to adapt to what they wanted to do with their lives. Okay, so that being said, we still are the ones with the issues. We are the Lagai people that Jesus is talking about. So, instead of spending all our time and our breath on condemning those who are already condemned by the way they live, why don't we really focus on the issues we have that condemn ourselves, that we are totally oblivious to? I love what Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders. In other words, stay in your lane. This is a real balancing act, isn't it? This thing about trying to figure out, am I judging? Am I just discerning? It's up to us to really use God's word to understand. Do I have a log in my eye? Or do I just need to balance the fact that I must be a discerning person, but not a condemning person? Now, as per usual, I tend to write these and go, oh, I'm good. And come to find out, I'm not good. And God pointed it out to me a couple days ago. An article came out in the Atlantic magazine, and the article was about the fact that all those who really destroyed lives during the COVID shutdown, and there are many, and the specifics of their actions I will not go into, but many, millions of lives were lost and ruined over some things that they now are saying, okay, the truth is, and they're saying, we're sorry. And this article was about amnesty, that we should just forgive and forget, let bygones be bygones, move on with life. And I had a visceral reaction to this article because I know it'll be the new talking points of the mainstream media and of our culture. Hey, it was no big deal. Don't worry about crimes committed against humanity. Don't worry about all that stuff. In fact, the exact quote was this from Emily Oster from Brown University. We need to forgive one another for what we did and said when we were in the dark about COVID. Okay? And, here's this, I'm sure, pagan person saying, forgive and forget. And I say, no, it's time to judge. It's time to condemn. It's time, and I can state a clear case for why this needs to happen. But it was my reaction to that as I was writing this lesson that God was going, Logai, Logai. How about you? I don't know if you've ever heard of the meteorologist from Fox News by the name of Janice Dean. She lost her father-in-law and mother-in-law because of the decisions made by authorities who put them in a place where they would die from COVID. And she was outraged, and she has the similar reaction how I reacted. She says this, many of us won't ever forgive or forget after leaders flooded their residences with COVID patients and never told us or protected them. They knew better. We deserve justice first. And then, of course, the great Thomas Sowell put it this way, it is hard to imagine a more stupid or more dangerous way of making decisions than by putting those decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong. The question is, whose job is it to make sure that they pay the price for being wrong? Give me the job. That's what I would say. And then I listened to Jesus. Do not judge unless you want to be judged by the same standards. You want to be judged by the mistakes you've made, by the decisions that have hurt other people. This is a very challenging lesson, but we are so lucky that Jesus pulls back peel after peel of the onion of our life and says at the heart of this really is about an attitude of superiority. And he's talking to you. He's talking to me. Well, you should see the people out in the world. Yes, of course they are, but there's a reason they're that way. They don't know him. So what's my reason? And what's your reason for living with attitudes of superiority that is so unbecoming of the one we claim to follow? And so I leave you with this very famous verse, and then the verse after that is not so famous. For God loved the world so much, he gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. So that's the verse we all know. The most famous verse. Everyone knows. We love that verse. We forget to read the next verse, which reads this way. God sent his Son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. As the chainsaw revs up to create sawdust, and there's a chance that some of us could get sawdust in our eyes, I wouldn't worry so much about the sawdust. To be honest, my problem isn't the sawdust. It's the log protruding from my eye. How about you? We're so lucky that God would be so honest with us to say, you know what, there's a better way to live. Follow my Son, who did not come to judge, but to save. Aren't you glad? Thanks for joining us.